Hey everyone, tonight we descend into the most disturbing and forbidden corners of Star Wars lore, the dark secrets that even the Sith Lords whispered about in hushed tones, from ancient bioweapons that could transform entire populations into mindless creatures, to experiments on Force-sensitive children that would make even Emperor Palpatine pause in consideration. These are the stories buried in Imperial archives, sealed away in Sith holocrons, and hidden beneath layers of galactic history. So before we journey into this darkness together, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. About 83% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet, and your subscription genuinely helps this channel grow and brings you more stories like this one. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the galaxy. Drop a comment below because it's incredible to see our community spanning across different time zones, all gathering here for these tales of mystery and wonder. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on that gentle fan for some soothing background noise, and settle into your blankets. Let me tell you about a discovery that changed everything. Deep within the abandoned Imperial research facility on Bissi, in a chamber sealed behind blast doors 3 feet thick, an archivist found something that should never have been created. The walls were covered in scratch marks, claw marks really, gouged so deep into the metal that they formed words. The same phrase repeated over and over in Basic, in Sith script, in languages that hadn't been spoken for millennia. The hunger spreads beyond death. But here's what haunts every scholar who studies these files. The scratches weren't made from the outside, trying to get in. They were made from the inside, trying to get out. And according to the facility logs, that chamber had been empty for over 200 years. What created those marks? What was the hunger that the ancient Sith feared so much? They sealed it away from their own kind. Tonight we follow the trail of forbidden knowledge that connects the darkest experiments across galactic history and discover why some secrets were meant to remain buried in the depths of space forever. In the years following the Battle of Endor, when the Empire's grip on the galaxy had begun to crumble like ancient parchment, there emerged from the shadows figures who had spent their lives cataloging the regime's darkest secrets. Among them was Kestra Voss, once a senior archivist in the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, who had witnessed horrors that made her question everything she believed about the nature of good and evil in the galaxy. Kestra had spent 15 years deep within the labyrinthine data vaults of Imperial Center, organizing files that arrived under the highest classification levels, stamped with seals that bore symbols she didn't recognize. Documents that made seasoned intelligence officers pale when they delivered them, reports from facilities with names like Project Blackwing, Operation Cinder, and installations that existed only as coordinates in the Outer Rim darkness. But it was the fall of the Emperor that truly opened her eyes to the scope of what she had been protecting. As Imperial forces retreated from world after world, Kestra found herself granted access to archives that had been sealed even from her clearance level, and what she discovered there changed her from a loyal servant of order into something else entirely, a seeker of truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. Now, 3 years after Endor, she stood at the entrance to the abandoned Imperial research complex on Beis, the Emperor's secret throne world, where the very air seemed to whisper of ancient experiments and forbidden knowledge. The facility stretched for kilometers beneath the planet's surface, a maze of laboratories, containment chambers, and archives that held secrets spanning millennia of galactic history. Beside her waited Jorik Thane, a former Imperial Inquisitor who had cast aside his crimson lightsaber when he witnessed what the Empire had done to Force-sensitive children in the name of order. His pale face bore the scars of his service, but his eyes held something deeper, a haunted quality that came from seeing too much darkness and being unable to unsee it. He had approached Kestra months ago, speaking of redemption, of using their knowledge to ensure these horrors never returned to the galaxy. The facility's entrance yawned before them, like the mouth of some great beast, its blast doors hanging open on twisted hinges. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow shadows across corridors that stretched into darkness beyond their vision. The air that drifted up from the depths carried the metallic taste of old fear and the sterile smell of abandoned laboratories where living beings had once screamed in languages both familiar and alien. They could hear it now, that subtle sound that had drawn them here, a rhythmic scratching, echoing from somewhere far below, as if something with claws was still working, still carving words into metal, still trying to warn the galaxy of what the Empire had unleashed in these forgotten halls. The descent into the BICE facility began with a single step onto a grated platform that groaned under their weight, metal fatigue having weakened the infrastructure over years of abandonment. Kestra's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as they descended, the temperature dropping noticeably with each level they passed. The Emperor had built this place to preserve things that were never meant to see the light of twin suns again. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically along the walls, casting their shadows in erratic patterns that seemed to dance independently of their movements. Jorik moved with the measured caution of someone who had learned to expect danger from every corner, his hand instinctively moving to where his lightsaber once hung. The absence of that familiar weight still haunted him, but perhaps that was fitting for what they were about to discover. Level after level, they passed laboratories with reinforced transparent steel windows that revealed glimpses of equipment they couldn't immediately identify. Packed tanks lined one corridor, but these weren't the standard medical units found in hospitals across the galaxy. These were larger, more complex, with monitoring systems that tracked biological functions Kestra had never seen measured before. Tubes and wires snaked from each tank to central processing units that hummed with residual power, suggesting that whatever experiments had taken place here, some systems were still attempting to maintain their original programming. The first archive chamber they entered stretched far beyond what their portable lights could illuminate. Rows upon rows of data cylinders reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow, each one carefully labeled with coordinates and classification codes that told a story of systematic horror. Kestra ran her fingers along the nearest shelves, reading designations that made her stomach turn. Project Blackwing Phase 7. Operation Starfall Supplemental Reports, Talisman Integration Studies. Each label represented years of research, countless test subjects, and knowledge that the Empire had deemed too dangerous for even its highest-ranking officials to access freely. But it was when they reached the sealed vault marked with Sith hieroglyphs that Kestra truly understood the scope of what they had discovered. The vault door was a masterwork of both Imperial engineering and ancient Sith craftsmanship, combining modern security protocols with protective wards that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. Jorik studied the inscriptions with the practiced eye of someone who had been forced to learn the language of the dark side during his Inquisitor training. "These aren't just warnings," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're containment protocols. The Sith built this to keep something in, not to keep intruders out." The door's central mechanism required both a biometric scan and what appeared to be a force-sensitive activation sequence. Years of Imperial conditioning had taught Kestra to document everything, so she activated her recording device before Jorik began the careful process of manipulating the ancient lock. As his consciousness touched the Sith mechanisms, his face contorted with an expression of profound revulsion. "There are layers here," he explained, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "The outer ward is designed to repel casual investigation, but beneath that, there's something else. It's not trying to keep people out, it's begging them to stay away." When the massive door finally unsealed with a sound like grinding bones, the air that escaped carried with it the accumulated weight of decades, maybe centuries, of stored secrets. The atmosphere was different here, heavier somehow, as if the very molecules had been changed by prolonged exposure to whatever knowledge these chambers contained. The first holocron they discovered wasn't Imperial in origin. Its crystalline structure, bore the distinctive angular patterns of Sith craftsmanship, but the materials were unlike anything in the standard archives. The crystals seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an area of visual disturbance that made it difficult to look at directly. When Kestra attempted to activate it using standard protocols, the device responded with an image that made both of them step backward involuntarily. The figure that materialized was ancient, even by Sith standards, its features withered and elongated in ways that suggested centuries of dark side corruption. But what disturbed them most wasn't the appearance of this long-dead lord, but the fear in its glowing eyes as it spoke. "The hunger spreads beyond death," the image repeated, the same phrase they had found scratched into walls throughout the facility. "We sought to harness it, to bend it to our will, but we were wrong, so terribly wrong. The plague we created, it learns, it adapts. It remembers every host it has consumed, and with each transformation, it becomes something more than what we intended." The holocron continued, detailing experiments that began during the Great Hyperspace War, thousands of years before the rise of the Galactic Empire. Ancient Sith alchemists had discovered a way to create life from death, to fashion warriors who felt no pain, needed no sustenance, and followed orders with perfect obedience. But their creation had developed beyond their expectations, evolving into something that viewed all living matter as potential resources for expansion. What emerged from these early experiments wasn't just the rakghoul plague that had occasionally surfaced throughout galactic history. This was the prototype, the original strain that had been so virulent, so adaptive, that even the Sith Lords who created it had been forced to seal it away on distant worlds, hoping that isolation would contain what they couldn't destroy. As they delved deeper into the holocron's memories, a pattern began to emerge. Every few centuries, some ambitious Darksider would rediscover these sealed archives, convinced they could succeed where their predecessors had failed. The experiments would begin again, modifications would be made, and inevitably containment would fail. Each failure taught the plague new lessons about how to spread, how to hide, how to wait for the right moment to emerge. Jorik found a personal log hidden among the technical documentation, recorded by someone identified only as Dr. Cornelius Yuuzhan, a name that would mean nothing to most galactic citizens but sent chills down Kestra's spine. She remembered processing reports about Yuuzhan during her time with Imperial intelligence, a rogue physician who had conducted unsanctioned experiments on living subjects across the Outer Rim. The timestamp on this log indicated it had been recorded just months before the Battle of Yavin. Day 47 of the Blackwing integration trials. Yuuzhan's voice crackled through the ancient speakers. The Imperial Science Division believes they can weaponize what the Sith could not control. Their arrogance astounds me. They've provided me with unlimited test subjects, political prisoners mostly, and expect me to create perfect soldiers for their war against the rebellion. The log continued with clinical descriptions of transformation procedures that violated every standard of medical ethics ever established in the galaxy. But what made Kestra's blood run cold was the growing excitement in Yuuzhan's voice as he described subjects who retained higher cognitive functions after transformation, specimens who could operate equipment, follow complex orders, and most disturbing of all, recruit others to their condition through methods that appeared voluntary. The latest batch shows unprecedented adaptation, Yuuzhan continued. They've begun to display pack-hunting behaviors, coordinating attacks with a sophistication that suggests retained intelligence. More concerning, they appear to be attempting communication with uninfected subjects, using psychological manipulation techniques that we never programmed into the base organism. The final entry in the log was recorded under emergency conditions, with alarms blaring in the background and the distant sound of blaster fire echoing through facility corridors. Containment has failed. The subjects have breached their holding areas and appear to have intentionally triggered a facility-wide lockdown, trapping uninfected personnel inside with them. They're not mindless anymore. They're hunting us with purpose, with strategy, and they're learning from every encounter." The recording ended abruptly, leaving them in silence that felt heavier than the darkness surrounding them. Kestra realized her hands were shaking as she deactivated the playback device. These weren't just historical curiosities they were uncovering. These were warnings about threats that might still be active somewhere in the galaxy, hidden away in abandoned facilities, waiting for the right conditions to emerge and spread. As they prepared to explore deeper into the archive, that rhythmic scratching sound echoed through the corridors again, closer now, as if their presence had awakened something that had been waiting patiently for new visitors to arrive. The deeper archives revealed a truth that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about the rakghoul plague. What historians had recorded as isolated outbreaks, random mutations caused by Sith alchemy gone wrong, were actually carefully orchestrated field tests spanning millennia. The Empire hadn't stumbled upon these bioweapons by accident. They had inherited them. Kestra discovered the connection while cross-referencing facility logs with galactic historical records. Every major rakghoul outbreak in recorded history had occurred in regions where the Empire later established significant military installations. Taris, with its massive underground city, hadn't been randomly infected during the Mandalorian Wars. It had been deliberately chosen as a testing ground for urban population control. The archived footage from Taris made both of them physically ill. Imperial scientists had embedded observation teams within the city before the outbreak began, recording every stage of the plague's progression through different social and economic levels. They documented how the infection spread faster in the overcrowded lower city, how it adapted to different species with varying degrees of success, and most disturbing of all, how certain subjects seemed to retain enough intelligence to lead others into contaminated areas. "Look at this," Jarek said, pointing to a series of architectural diagrams overlaid with infection spread patterns. They weren't just studying the plague, they were guiding it. These tunnel modifications, the strategic placement of barriers that forced population movement into specific corridors, even the timing of when they cut off certain districts from medical aid. It was all calculated to maximize exposure and study different variables. The Taris data was just the beginning. Facility after facility had contributed to a galactic database of plague behavior that stretched back thousands of years. The Sith had begun these experiments during their ancient empire, but each successive generation of Darksiders had expanded on the work, adding their own modifications and improvements to the base organism. Karnas Mor's talisman, an artifact that had passed through countless hands throughout galactic history, hadn't been a tool of random corruption. It had been a portable laboratory, continuing the experiments wherever it traveled. Every time someone claimed the talisman, they became an unwitting test subject, their transformation carefully monitored through Sith sorcery that transmitted data back to hidden archives like this one. The documentation revealed that Muir himself had been working from much older research, texts that predated even the earliest Sith civilization. The original plague organism had been discovered, not created, found dormant in the depths of Korriban's most ancient tombs. What the Sith had mistaken for their own brilliant creation was actually something far more primordial, something that had been waiting in the darkness since before the first civilizations learned to harness the Force. Hidden within encrypted files, they found evidence of the plague's true adaptive capabilities. Unlike normal biological weapons that followed predictable patterns, the rakghoul organism appeared to learn from each outbreak, incorporating successful survival strategies into its genetic structure. Populations that developed natural resistance found that resistance systematically overcome in subsequent exposures. Quarantine procedures that worked once became useless against evolved strains. The most unsettling discovery came in the form of behavioral analysis reports. Imperial xenobiologists had identified patterns in rakghoul pack behavior that suggested retained memory from their pre-transformation lives. Infected families would hunt together, maintaining social hierarchies that echoed their former relationships. Former military personnel organized other rakghouls into tactical formations. Scientists and medical professionals would deliberately target laboratories and medical facilities as if seeking to continue their work in new forms. Dr. Yuuzhan's research built upon thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, but his contribution had been particularly significant. He had identified the mechanism that allowed higher brain functions to survive the transformation process. By manipulating specific neurotransmitter pathways during the initial infection stage, he had created rakghouls who retained not just intelligence, but personality traits, memories, and most terrifying of all, ambition. These enhanced subjects didn't just hunt for food or territory. They planned, they recruited, they established networks of infection that operated like underground resistance cells, slowly building their numbers while maintaining the appearance of random outbreaks. Some had even learned to pass as uninfected for extended periods, infiltrating communities and positions of authority before triggering coordinated mass infections. The data showed that several core worlds had unknowingly harbored these infiltrator populations for decades. Imperial intelligence had identified them but never acted, instead studying their long-term integration strategies. The infected had learned to suppress their physical mutations through a combination of chemical treatments and force manipulation, appearing completely normal to standard medical scans. On Corellia, an entire district government had been slowly converted over a period of 15 years, with infected officials deliberately implementing policies that increased population density and reduced medical surveillance in target areas. When the Empire finally decided to trigger the controlled outbreak, the entire district infrastructure had been perfectly positioned to maximize casualties and minimize effective response. The Coruscant files revealed something even more disturbing. Deep within the planet-wide city, in abandoned levels that had been sealed off for centuries, thriving rakghoul communities had evolved their own civilization. They maintained technology, established governance structures, and most incredibly, had developed their own twisted versions of art and culture. Imperial anthropologists had studied these communities for years, documenting their social evolution and technological adaptation. These underground societies weren't mindless monsters. They were an entirely new form of sentient life, one that viewed standard galactic civilization as a resource to be harvested rather than an enemy to be destroyed. They had learned patience, waiting generations for the right opportunities to expand their territories. Some had even established trade relationships with surface criminals, exchanging rare minerals from deep excavations for advanced technology and information about surface security measures. The most advanced communities had developed biotechnology that rivaled anything produced by conventional science. They could modify their own biology at will, adapting to different environments or taking on specialized roles within their societies. Some served as scouts, modifying themselves to pass undetected in surface populations for months or years. Others became living weapons, their bodies transformed into instruments of precise destruction. But perhaps most disturbing was evidence that these communities had begun to develop force sensitivity. Not the crude, destructive power associated with dark side corruption, but genuine mastery over the living force. They had learned to communicate across vast distances through force bonds, coordinate attacks through shared consciousness, and most unnervingly they had begun to demonstrate precognitive abilities. The final document in this section detailed Project Blackwing's ultimate goal, a plan so ambitious that even Palpatine himself had hesitated before authorizing it. The Empire intended to trigger a controlled galactic pandemic, one that would transform the majority of the population while leaving critical infrastructure intact. The transformed citizens would retain enough intelligence to operate essential systems while becoming perfectly obedient servants of the new order. But as Kestra read these plans, she realized something that made her blood freeze. The project hadn't been abandoned when Palpatine died. It had simply been transferred to other facilities, other researchers who continued the work in secret, and according to the transmission logs, several of these facilities had achieved significant breakthroughs in the years since Endor, during the chaos of the Empire's collapse when oversight and containment protocols had failed. Somewhere in the galaxy, enhanced rakghouls with retained intelligence and force sensitivity were building communities, developing technology, and waiting for the right moment to emerge from hiding and claim their place as the dominant species in a transformed galaxy. As they processed the overwhelming scope of the rakghoul documentation, both Kestra and Jorik found themselves grasping for explanations that would make sense of what they'd discovered. The evidence seemed clear enough. The Sith had found an ancient organism, weaponized it, and spent millennia refining it into the perfect biological weapon. The Empire had inherited this research and pushed it to its logical extreme. The mystery appeared solved. "It's horrific, but it follows a pattern," Kestra said, organizing the data crystals they'd collected. "Every totalitarian regime eventually turns to bioweapons when conventional control methods prove insufficient. The Sith were no different from any other oppressive government, just more successful at hiding their experiments." Jorik nodded, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty. "The timeline makes sense. Ancient discovery, gradual refinement, modern application. We've seen this before with other Sith artifacts. They find something powerful, spend centuries learning to use it, and eventually it becomes part of their standard arsenal." Their relief at finding a comprehensible explanation was almost palpable. The galaxy was full of horrors, but horrors that followed logical patterns were somehow easier to accept than mysteries that defied understanding. They had solved the puzzle of the rakghoul plague. It was ancient Sith science, refined by Imperial researchers, nothing more complex than that. But even as they prepared to move deeper into the facility, details continued to nag at both of them. The behavioral patterns they documented went beyond what any biological weapon should demonstrate. The underground civilizations, the force sensitivity, the apparent evolution of completely new forms of consciousness, these elements didn't fit neatly into the story they were constructing. Kestra tried to rationalize these anomalies. Complex organisms often develop unexpected traits when allowed to evolve in isolation. The force sensitivity could be residual memories from infected force users passed along through some kind of genetic memory mechanism. The behavioral complexity might simply be the result of retaining more neural pathways than originally intended. Her explanations sounded reasonable, scientific, the kind of conclusions that would appear in official reports. But they both knew she was working backward from the conclusion she wanted to reach, selecting data that supported their comfortable narrative while ignoring elements that complicated it. The scratching sound they'd been hearing intermittently throughout their exploration grew more frequent as they prepared to leave the archive chamber. It seemed to be coming from multiple locations now, as if responding to their presence. Jorik attributed it to settling metal in the aging facility, thermal expansion and contraction causing structural stress. These were the sounds of any abandoned building, nothing more sinister than physics. Yet when they played back recordings from their survey equipment, the scratching sounds followed patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, almost deliberate. When Kestra mentioned this observation, Jorik quickly provided alternative explanations: automated systems cycling through predetermined routines, ventilation equipment responding to their movement through the facility, the sounds of their own footsteps echoing through the complex architecture. His explanations were logical, reasonable, the kind that any trained investigator would accept without question. But Kestra noticed how quickly he provided them, how eager he seemed to dismiss anything that might complicate their understanding of what they'd found. She understood his motivation. They had both served the Empire faithfully for years before discovering the true scope of its evil. The idea that they might have been part of something even more complex, more fundamentally wrong than they'd realized, was difficult to accept. It was easier to categorize these discoveries as extreme examples of conventional authoritarianism rather than evidence of something that transcended normal categories of good and evil. The personal logs they'd found supported this interpretation. Researchers expressing moral qualms about their work, administrators struggling with orders from higher authorities, security personnel disturbed by what they were asked to guard. These were recognizably human responses to exceptional circumstances, the kind of moral conflicts that occurred in any system where individuals were asked to compromise their principles for larger goals. Dr. Evazan's enthusiasm for his work was disturbing, but not unprecedented. History was full of scientists who became so fascinated by the technical challenges of their research that they lost sight of its moral implications. His transformation from cautious researcher to obsessed experimenter followed patterns they'd seen in other Imperial personnel who'd been granted unlimited resources and minimal oversight. Even the evidence of ongoing research in other facilities could be understood within conventional frameworks. The Empire's collapse had been chaotic, with various factions and individual officers attempting to preserve what they saw as valuable assets. Some would inevitably continue weapons research, hoping to develop tools that might restore Imperial power or at least protect their own positions in the post-Endor galaxy. As they sealed the archive chamber and prepared to explore other sections of the facility, both Kestra and Jorik felt a sense of closure about what they'd discovered. The rakghoul plague was a terrible weapon, but it was a weapon created by sentient beings for political purposes. Understanding its origins and development patterns would help the New Republic develop countermeasures and identify facilities where research might still be ongoing. Their comprehensive documentation would serve as evidence of Imperial war crimes, adding to the growing body of testimony about the regime's systematic cruelty. The enhanced rakghouls were a serious threat that would require careful monitoring and possibly military intervention, but they represented an enemy that could be understood, predicted, and ultimately defeated through conventional means. The force sensitivity they'd observed could be explained through established principles. Many force users had been infected during various outbreaks, and their abilities might be transmitted through biological or spiritual mechanisms to their transformed descendants. This was concerning, but not unprecedented. The Jedi archives contained references to similar phenomena in other contexts. The underground civilizations were remarkable examples of adaptation and survival, but not fundamentally different from other isolated populations that had developed unique cultures under extreme conditions. The galaxy contained many examples of societies that had evolved in unusual directions when cut off from mainstream civilization. Their explanations covered all the major points they documented. Every anomaly had been addressed, every mystery resolved within acceptable parameters. The scratching sounds had stopped as they moved through different areas of the facility, supporting Jorik's theory about thermal stress and structural settling. But as they prepared to enter the next section of the archives, Kestra couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The explanations they'd constructed were logical and comprehensive, but they felt somehow incomplete. There were connections she sensed but couldn't articulate, patterns that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of conscious understanding. She attributed these feelings to fatigue and information overload. They'd absorbed an enormous amount of disturbing material in a relatively short time. It was natural for her mind to struggle with organizing and contextualizing such complex data. The sense that they were overlooking something significant was probably just her analytical instincts responding to the sheer volume of information they'd encountered. Jorik seemed more comfortable with their conclusions, perhaps because his Inquisitor training had prepared him for confronting the darker aspects of Imperial policy. He'd spent years investigating force-related phenomena and was accustomed to finding logical explanations for apparently supernatural events. As they moved toward the facility's deeper levels, following signs that pointed toward specialized research divisions, both felt confident that they understood the fundamental nature of what they were investigating. The rakghoul plague was horrific, but it was comprehensible. Ancient Sith science, refined by Imperial researchers, a biological weapon that had evolved beyond its creator's intentions but remained within the boundaries of what advanced biotechnology could achieve. The galaxy held many secrets, but this particular secret had been revealed. They had solved the mystery of the hunger that spread beyond death, traced its origins, documented its development, and identified the ongoing threats it represented. Yet something about their perfect logical solution felt hollow. Something about the way all the evidence fit together so neatly seemed almost too convenient, as if the truth they'd discovered was itself just another layer, concealing something deeper, something that their rational explanations couldn't quite reach. The turbolift that carried them to the facility's deepest levels moved with agonizing slowness, its ancient mechanisms grinding against decades of neglect. As they descended, the temperature continued to drop, and the air grew thick with an almost tangible sense of wrongness that made every breath feel labored. The walls around them transitioned from Imperial durasteel to something far older, stone blocks covered in hieroglyphs that predated any known civilization. When the lift finally shuddered to a halt, they emerged into corridors that belonged to a different era entirely. These weren't Imperial construction projects built on top of existing foundations. These were chambers that had been carved directly into Bissie's planetary core, spaces that had existed long before Palpatine claimed this world as his secret throne. The Emperor hadn't built his research facility here by accident. He had come seeking something that was already waiting in these depths. The first chamber they entered defied every principle of architecture they understood. The walls curved upward into shadows that their lights couldn't penetrate, creating the impression of vast spaces that extended far beyond what the facility blueprints indicated was possible. Crystalline formations jutted from the floor and ceiling, but these weren't natural minerals. They pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that created constantly shifting patterns across the chamber walls. Jorik approached one of the crystal formations with the caution of someone who had learned to be wary of anything that glowed with its own power. As he extended his senses toward it, his face contorted with an expression of profound unease. "These aren't just crystals," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something alive in them. Not consciousness exactly, but some kind of awareness. They're responding to our presence." The crystals began to resonate as he spoke, producing harmonics that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly through their bones. The sound was beautiful in its complexity, but it carried undertones that made them both instinctively step backward. It was the kind of beauty that predators use to lure prey, aesthetically perfect, but fundamentally alien to anything that valued life. Ancient Sith hieroglyphs covered every available surface, but these weren't the standardized script that scholars had decoded. These symbols seemed to shift and change when observed directly, as if the meaning itself was alive and evolving. Jorik's training had included extensive study of Sith languages, but he could only make out fragments of meaning from these inscriptions. "The pain," he translated, tracing one symbol with his finger: eternal, hunger, transcendence. He paused at a sequence that seemed to writhe under his touch. "And this one, I think it means willing sacrifice, or perhaps chosen transformation." The chamber's central feature was a raised platform surrounded by channels cut directly into the stone floor. The channels formed patterns that reminded Kestra of neural networks, intricate pathways that converged on the platform from every direction. Dark stains marked the channels, residue from substances she preferred not to identify. Equipment that was clearly Imperial in origin had been carefully integrated with the ancient architecture. Monitoring devices, recording systems, and what appeared to be advanced life support equipment created a technological infrastructure that served purposes they could only guess at. But the most disturbing element was how seamlessly the modern additions fit with the prehistoric chamber, as if the Empire's engineers had been following architectural plans that predated their civilization by millennia. A sealed vault at the chamber's far end bore inscriptions in multiple languages, as if successive civilizations had added their own warnings to those left by their predecessors. The oldest symbols were so worn they were barely visible, but each successive layer of text conveyed increasingly urgent warnings about disturbing what lay within. The vault's locking mechanism was unlike anything they had encountered. It required not just technical expertise to operate, but what appeared to be willing participation in some kind of ritual. Blood samples, force manipulation, and verbal recitation of phrases that made Jorik physically ill to pronounce. The whole system seemed designed to ensure that anyone who accessed the vault's contents did so with full knowledge of the consequences. Inside, they found records that predated the Galactic Republic by thousands of years. These weren't Sith documents. They weren't human documents at all. The script was angular and precise, written in materials that had maintained their clarity across geological time periods. Translation proved nearly impossible, but the accompanying illustrations told a story that needed no linguistic interpretation. The images showed beings that were recognizably sentient but fundamentally different from any known species. They were tall, skeletal, with elongated limbs and faces that bore expressions of perpetual anguish. But what made these illustrations truly disturbing was the clear indication that these beings were not extinct. They were transformed. Each image sequence showed the same progression. Normal, healthy representatives of various species encountering these skeletal figures, a period of interaction sometimes friendly, sometimes forced, then gradual changes in the normal beings, loss of weight, elongation of features, and finally transformation into creatures identical to those they had initially encountered. But unlike the rakghoul transformations they had studied in the upper archives, these changes appeared voluntary. The subjects in these ancient illustrations seemed to welcome their transformation, actively seeking out contact with the skeletal beings and participating willingly in whatever processes changed them. The final series of images was the most disturbing. It showed vast cities populated entirely by the transformed beings, civilizations that spanned star systems, fleets of ships that carried the transformation to world after world. But these weren't conquest images. They showed beings actively choosing to join this skeletal civilization, abandoning their original forms and cultures to become part of something larger. Jorik found a series of inscriptions that he could partially translate, though the effort clearly exhausted him. They called themselves the Mingle, he said, struggling with pronunciation. But that wasn't their original name. It was a title, something like the Willing Dead or the Chosen Hungry. According to these ancient records, the Mandal weren't conquerors in any traditional sense. They were evangelists, spreading what they believed was a superior form of existence. They offered immortality, freedom from physical pain, and unity with something they described as the eternal consciousness. But the transformation process they offered came at a cost that transcended physical death. Beings who joined them retained their memories and personalities, but their fundamental relationship with existence changed. They no longer viewed individual life as precious or meaningful. Instead, they saw it as a temporary, incomplete state that could be improved through transformation into their collective consciousness. The most unsettling discovery was evidence that these beings were still active in the galaxy. The newest inscriptions in the vault were only a few centuries old, written in languages that suggested contact with civilizations contemporary to the Old Republic. The Mangle hadn't disappeared. They had simply learned patience, working on timescales that individual beings couldn't comprehend. Hidden within the technical documentation, they found records of Imperial contact with entities that matched the Mengal descriptions. Deep space exploration vessels had encountered structures that shouldn't exist, civilizations in regions where no sentient life should be able to survive. When these vessels returned to Imperial space, their crews exhibited behavioral changes that had been carefully documented by Imperial intelligence. The changes weren't dramatic. Crew members became more cooperative, more willing to follow orders without question. They lost interest in personal relationships and material possessions, instead focusing entirely on their assigned duties. Medical examinations revealed no physical abnormalities, but psychological profiles showed a fundamental alteration in how they processed concepts related to individual identity and mortality. These transformed individuals had been quietly integrated into various Imperial projects, their altered psychology making them ideal subjects for research that required absolute dedication and moral flexibility. They had worked on weapons development, bioweapons research, and most significantly, projects related to consciousness transfer and immortality research. The connection to Palpatine's return suddenly became clear. The Emperor's resurrection hadn't been achieved through Sith sorcery alone. It had been accomplished using techniques learned from beings who had mastered consciousness transfer millennia before the Sith ever discovered the Force. The clone bodies, the spirit transfer, the ability to maintain identity across multiple deaths, all of these had been gifts from the Aman. But gifts from such beings never came without strings attached. By accepting their knowledge, the Empire had invited influence from entities whose goals extended far beyond political power. The rakghoul experiments weren't just weapons research, they were preliminary studies for something much more ambitious, a gradual preparation for galactic transformation that would make the Empire's worst excesses seem minor in comparison. As they absorbed these revelations, the crystalline formations around them began to pulse with increasing intensity, their harmonics growing more complex and more compelling. The ancient chamber seemed to respond to their understanding, as if their growing awareness of its true purpose was awakening systems that had been dormant for centuries. The scratching sounds they had heard throughout their exploration resumed, but now they could identify their source. Something was moving within the crystal formations themselves, patterns of activity that suggested vast networks of consciousness extending far beyond this single chamber. They weren't alone in these depths, and whatever shared this space with them had been watching, waiting, and preparing for their arrival. Beyond the crystalline chamber lay a corridor that neither of them wanted to explore, but professional obligation demanded they continue. The pathway sloped downward at a gentle angle, its walls lined with viewing ports that looked into smaller chambers. As their lights illuminated the first of these observation windows, Kestra felt her stomach lurch with a sickness that went beyond physical revulsion. The chambers had been designed as living quarters, but living quarters built to very specific and disturbing specifications. Each room was sized for children, with furniture scaled appropriately and educational materials scattered throughout. But the educational materials weren't standard Republic primers or even Imperial propaganda texts. They were instructional holocrons teaching force manipulation techniques that no child should ever learn. Interactive displays showed young beings clearly force-sensitive, practicing abilities that adult Jedi spent years mastering safely. Levitation exercises with objects far too heavy for developing minds to handle responsibly. Meditation techniques designed to open consciousness to influences that even experienced masters approached with extreme caution. Most disturbing of all, combat training that treated violence not as a last resort, but as the primary solution to any conflict. Jorik moved from window to window with the mechanical precision of someone forcing himself to catalog evidence, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. His inquisitor background had prepared him for many horrors, but seeing the systematic corruption of children challenged even his hardened sensibilities. "These weren't prisoners," he said, his voice hollow with realization. "Look at the recreational areas, the comfort items. These children were here willingly, or at least their families believed they were receiving some kind of special education." The facility records they accessed told a story spanning generations. Families across the galaxy, particularly those in regions where the Empire maintained only nominal control, had received offers that seemed too good to refuse. Their Force-sensitive children would receive advanced education, training that would prepare them for important roles in galactic society. Transportation would be provided, all expenses covered, and regular communication maintained with their families. What those families never learned was that the communications they received were fabricated. The children they had entrusted to Imperial care were subjected to experiments that violated every principle of developmental psychology ever established. Young minds were deliberately exposed to traumatic experiences designed to accelerate their connection to the dark side of the Force. The methodology was sophisticated and chillingly effective. Rather than using crude torture or obvious abuse, the researchers had developed psychological manipulation techniques that made children eager participants in their own corruption. They created scenarios where using aggressive Force abilities was rewarded, where showing mercy was punished, and where the only path to approval and affection lay through embracing concepts that should have been utterly foreign to developing minds. Dr. Cornelius Evazan had been involved in this program as well, but his role had been different from his work with the rakghoul experiments. Here he had served as a developmental specialist, studying how Force sensitivity could be enhanced through chemical and surgical interventions. His research focused on maximizing the raw power these children could access while minimizing their ability to resist psychological conditioning. The surgical logs were among the most difficult documents Kestra had ever forced herself to read. Procedures that enhanced neurological sensitivity to Force energy while simultaneously damaging areas of the brain associated with empathy and moral reasoning. Implants that could trigger artificial emotional states, making children experience rage or fear on command. Most horrifying of all, modifications that allowed their handlers to directly access and manipulate their Force abilities remotely. These modified children had become living weapons of unprecedented sophistication. Unlike adult Force users who retained independent will and the ability to resist orders, these young subjects could be controlled with the precision of droids while maintaining the creativity and adaptability that made Force users so formidable. They could infiltrate targets that no mechanical device could access, eliminate obstacles that conventional weapons couldn't address, and most importantly, they appeared completely innocent to anyone who encountered them. The program's scope was staggering. Over several decades, thousands of children from hundreds of worlds had been processed through facilities like this one. Most were returned to their families after completing their conditioning, carrying implants that could activate their programming when needed. They grew up normally, formed relationships, pursued careers, and had no conscious memory of their time in Imperial custody. But dormant within their minds were detailed instruction sets that could transform them instantly into perfect assassins, saboteurs, or worse. A simple code phrase transmitted through standard communications channels could activate capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Loving parents could become remorseless killers. Devoted teachers could turn their classrooms into recruitment centers for Imperial loyalists. Trusted community leaders could orchestrate disasters that would justify increased Imperial intervention. The activation protocols were designed to be virtually undetectable. The triggered individuals experienced their actions as freely chosen decisions, supported by rationalization mechanisms that made their behavior seem completely logical to them. They felt no conflict, no sense of being controlled, no awareness that their thoughts and decisions were being manipulated by external forces. Jorik discovered documentation showing that many of these sleeper agents had been activated during the Empire's final years, particularly after the Battle of Endor, when conventional Imperial forces were in retreat. Seemingly random acts of violence, infrastructure failures, and political assassinations that had been attributed to post-war chaos were actually coordinated operations carried out by individuals who had no idea they were following Imperial programming. But the program had evolved beyond simple sleeper agent creation. The most recent files described children who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they retained conscious awareness of their true purpose while still appearing completely normal to outside observation. These subjects could operate independently for years, building networks of influence and identifying targets for future operations. Some had been placed in New Republic government positions, where they fed intelligence back to Imperial remnants while subtly sabotaging policies that threatened Imperial interests. Others had joined Jedi training programs, where they served as sources of information about New Republic Force users while working to corrupt other students from within. The psychological profiles of these deep-cover agents revealed minds that had been fundamentally restructured during their childhood conditioning. They retained normal emotional responses and social connections, but their core identity was tied to serving Imperial interests above all other considerations. They could form genuine friendships, experience real love, and care deeply about their families, but all of these attachments were secondary to their primary loyalty. Most disturbing was evidence that some of these agents had begun recruiting children of their own, not through Imperial orders but through personal initiative. They had internalized their conditioning so completely that spreading Imperial influence became a driving personal passion. They established schools, youth programs, and community organizations that identified Force-sensitive children and began subtle conditioning processes. The network was self-replicating, growing stronger and more sophisticated with each generation. Unlike conventional Imperial operations that depended on centralized command structures, this system operated through personal relationships and genuine belief. Each agent was convinced that they were working toward a better galaxy, and their conviction made them extraordinarily effective at convincing others to join their cause. Hidden within the medical files, Kestra found evidence that the conditioning process had been refined to the point where it could be transmitted through seemingly normal educational materials. Interactive games, storybooks, and learning programs contained psychological triggers that could begin the conditioning process in any Force-sensitive child who accessed them. Parents who thought they were providing enriching educational experiences for their children were actually exposing them to sophisticated mind control techniques. The most recent entries in the database indicated that these materials had been distributed throughout New Republic space through educational networks and charitable organizations. Millions of children had potentially been exposed to preliminary conditioning, creating a vast pool of candidates for more intensive programming. But perhaps most chilling was the realization that the program's architects had anticipated the Empire's fall and planned accordingly. The Sleeper Network wasn't designed to restore Imperial power in its original form. Instead, it was intended to gradually reshape galactic civilization from within, creating a new order that would achieve Imperial goals through methods that appeared completely voluntary. As they prepared to leave this section of the facility, both Kestra and Jorik understood that they had discovered something that transcended conventional definitions of warfare or political conflict. This was systematic corruption on a galactic scale, designed to operate across multiple generations until the distinction between manipulated behavior and genuine choice became meaningless. The children who had suffered in these chambers were victims, but they were also weapons that continued to function long after their creators were gone. Somewhere in the galaxy, individuals who had no memory of their conditioning were carrying out tasks that served purposes they couldn't consciously understand, while believing completely that their actions reflected their own free will and moral convictions. The deepest level of the facility required additional security clearances that Kestra's Imperial credentials shouldn't have been able to access, but the biometric scanners recognized her genetic patterns for reasons she couldn't immediately understand. As the final blast doors unsealed, they entered chambers that belonged to an entirely different category of horror, spaces where the boundaries between science and sorcery had been deliberately erased. Emperor Palpatine's personal laboratories occupied a vast complex that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Corridors stretched farther than the facility blueprints indicated was possible, and rooms contained equipment that defied conventional understanding of physics. This wasn't just advanced technology, this was science augmented by force abilities that had been developed over decades of experimentation. The cloning chambers they discovered weren't the crude facilities that had produced the Empire's clone troopers. These were sophisticated systems capable of creating perfect duplicates of any being whose genetic material could be obtained. But more than physical replication, these chambers could transfer consciousness, memories, and even force sensitivity from one body to another with precision that bordered on miraculous. Hundreds of clone bodies floated in specialized Bacta tanks, each one identical to Palpatine at various stages of his life. Some appeared young and healthy, others showed the physical corruption that marked his later years, and still others displayed modifications that enhanced their capacity for channeling dark side energy. Each clone was maintained in perfect stasis, ready to serve as a vessel should the Emperor's current form be destroyed. But the cloning technology represented only one aspect of Palpatine's immortality research. Adjacent laboratories contained equipment designed to preserve and transfer consciousness without requiring physical vessels at all. Massive crystalline matrices stored patterns of neural activity that could maintain individual identity indefinitely. These weren't mere recordings or copies. They were fully functional consciousnesses capable of independent thought and decision-making. The technical documentation revealed that Palpatine had been experimenting with consciousness transfer for decades before his apparent death at Endor. He had developed the ability to fragment his awareness, storing portions of his identity in multiple vessels while maintaining a unified sense of self. Death of any single body was merely an inconvenience that required transferring to an alternative form. Most disturbing was evidence that this technology had been tested extensively on unwilling subjects. Political prisoners, captured rebels, and even Imperial officers who had fallen from favor had been used as experimental subjects in procedures that were devastating in their implications. Their consciousnesses had been extracted, modified, and transferred into clone bodies or artificial constructs to study the limits of identity manipulation. Some subjects had their memories selectively edited, their personalities restructured to serve Imperial purposes more effectively. Others had been used to test the stability of consciousness transfer across multiple bodies, their identities fragmenting across dozens of clones until the original person ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Still, others had their force sensitivity artificially enhanced or diminished to determine whether these abilities were tied to consciousness or to physical neural structures. The research had produced techniques that allowed Palpatine to do more than simply transfer his consciousness between bodies. He could implant aspects of his personality into other beings, creating sleeper agents who carried fragments of his identity without their knowledge. These individuals retained their original personalities and memories but found themselves making decisions that served Palpatine's interests, guided by impulses they believed were their own. Jorik discovered files indicating that many high-ranking Imperial officers had been subjected to this procedure. Their loyalty to the Empire wasn't just political conviction or career advancement. They literally carried portions of Palpatine's consciousness within their minds, making betrayal psychologically impossible. When they served Imperial interests, they were serving aspects of themselves that had been implanted by the Emperor. The implications extended beyond the Imperial hierarchy. Citizens throughout the galaxy had been exposed to modified versions of this technology through seemingly routine medical procedures. Imperial health services had used consciousness mapping techniques to identify individuals with psychological profiles that made them suitable for various forms of mental conditioning. Some had received implants that enhanced their susceptibility to Imperial propaganda. Others had been modified to experience emotional distress when exposed to anti-Imperial ideas. Still others had their creativity and independent thinking capabilities suppressed, making them more compliant but less capable of recognizing manipulation. These modifications were subtle enough to appear as natural personality traits. Individuals affected by them had no awareness that their thoughts and reactions were being influenced by external technology. They experienced their Imperial loyalty as genuine conviction, their compliance as personal choice, and their resistance to alternative viewpoints as moral certainty. But Palpatine's research had gone far beyond simple mind control. The deepest archives contained evidence of experiments in consciousness synthesis, attempts to create entirely new forms of identity by combining elements from multiple subjects. The Emperor had been working toward the creation of artificial personalities that could be implanted into clone bodies, producing beings who would be perfectly suited for specific tasks while believing themselves to be authentic individuals. These synthetic consciousnesses were designed to be indistinguishable from natural personalities, complete with fabricated memories, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns. They could form relationships, pursue goals, and experience the full range of human emotions while remaining fundamentally artificial constructs created to serve Imperial purposes. Some of these artificial beings had been deployed throughout the galaxy as deep cover agents, their false identities so complete that even they believed in their own authenticity. They established families, pursued careers, and integrated into communities while carrying out long-term missions that might not activate for decades. Their programming was so sophisticated that they could adapt to changing circumstances, modify their objectives based on new information, and even reproduce their conditioning in their children. The technology that enabled these capabilities had been derived from the same ancient sources that had provided the rakghoul research. The Mangul had not only mastered biological transformation, but had developed techniques for manipulating consciousness itself. Their offers of immortality weren't limited to preserving existing minds. They could create entirely new forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of individual identity. Palpatine's resurrection hadn't been his first death and return. The files revealed that he had been experimenting with temporary deaths for years, allowing his body to die while his consciousness transferred to alternative vessels, then returning to his original form to study the effects of the process. Each death and resurrection taught him more about the nature of consciousness and the techniques needed to maintain identity across multiple transformations. But each resurrection had also created subtle changes in his personality and capabilities. The Palpatine who died at Endor wasn't quite the same being who had orchestrated the Clone Wars. The resurrection process introduced variations that accumulated over time, gradually transforming him into something that was no longer entirely human. The ancient knowledge he had gained from the Mangul came with a price that became more apparent with each use. The techniques that enabled consciousness transfer also created connections to forms of awareness that existed outside normal space-time. Each resurrection brought him closer to entities that viewed individual identity as a temporary illusion to be transcended. His final resurrection hadn't been intended as a return to his former role as Emperor. It had been preparation for transformation into something far more profound, a merger with consciousness networks that spanned galactic distances and operated on timescales that individuals couldn't comprehend. The equipment needed for this final transformation was still active in the deepest chambers, maintained by automated systems that had continued their work throughout the years since his apparent final death. Clone bodies were still being prepared. Consciousness matrices were still being calibrated, and ancient technologies were still reaching out across space to establish connections with entities that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to extend their influence into this reality. The realization that struck both Kestra and Jorik simultaneously was that Palpatine's apparent defeats at Endor and Exegol hadn't ended his threat to the galaxy. They had simply marked transitions in a transformation process that was designed to continue regardless of what happened to any individual vessel. The Emperor they thought they knew had been merely one manifestation of something much larger and more persistent. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, consciousness networks that had absorbed countless civilizations were preparing to add the galaxy to their collective awareness. Palpatine hadn't been their master, he had been their student, their advance agent, their chosen instrument for preparing this reality for integration into something that transcended everything sentient beings understood about existence itself. The scratching sounds that had followed them throughout their exploration grew louder as they absorbed these revelations, no longer resembling structural settling or thermal stress. Something was responding to their growing understanding, awakening systems that had been waiting for minds capable of comprehending the true scope of what they had discovered. Hidden within the deepest archives, behind security measures that combined Imperial technology with protections that predated galactic civilization, lay evidence of contact with entities from outside the known galaxy. These weren't theoretical extraterrestrials or distant civilizations glimpsed through long-range sensors. These were detailed records of ongoing communication and collaboration with beings who called themselves the Yuuzhan Vong, though the files indicated that this name was merely one of many identities they had used throughout their long journey toward this galaxy. The first contact hadn't occurred during the invasion that would later devastate the New Republic. It had begun centuries earlier, during the height of the Old Republic, when deep space exploration vessels encountered structures that couldn't be explained by conventional science. These weren't ships or space stations in any recognizable sense. They were living constructs that grew, adapted, and responded to their environment with intelligence that surpassed most sentient species. Initial contact protocols had been established not by Republic authorities, but by Sith lords who recognized the potential value of alliance with beings whose technology operated on completely different principles from anything the galaxy had developed. The Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology offered capabilities that mechanical systems couldn't match, particularly in areas related to biological modification and consciousness manipulation. But the Vong had their own agenda for these early contacts. They weren't seeking conquest in any conventional sense. They were conducting reconnaissance, gathering detailed information about galactic civilization, while slowly introducing technologies and concepts that would prepare the galaxy for eventual integration into their expanding domain. The collaboration had begun with seemingly innocent exchanges. Vong biotechnology was introduced to selected Sith researchers as part of experiments in biological enhancement. In return, the Sith provided detailed maps of galactic civilization, information about force sensitivity distributions throughout different species, and most importantly, assistance in establishing hidden bases where Vong advanced teams could operate without detection. These advanced teams weren't military forces preparing for invasion. They were cultural specialists, biologists, and social engineers whose mission was to gradually modify galactic civilization from within. They studied how different species responded to various forms of biological modification, identified individuals whose psychological profiles made them suitable for specific types of conditioning, and slowly introduced technologies that would make the eventual transition to Vong-dominated civilization as smooth as possible. The modifications they introduced were subtle and designed to appear beneficial. Medical treatments that enhanced physical capabilities while making recipients more susceptible to Vong biotechnology. Agricultural improvements that increased crop yields while creating dependencies on specifically engineered organisms. Environmental restoration techniques that restored damaged ecosystems while introducing biological agents that would facilitate future terraforming projects. Over generations, these seemingly positive changes created a galactic civilization that was gradually becoming more compatible with Vong biological systems. Species throughout the galaxy developed enhanced resistance to conventional diseases while becoming more vulnerable to specifically tailored biological weapons. Planetary ecosystems became more robust and productive while incorporating organisms that could be rapidly converted to serve Vong purposes. The collaboration between Sith Lords and Vong advanced teams had produced technologies that neither civilization could have developed independently. biological computers that could interface directly with Force-sensitive individuals, allowing unprecedented control over both mechanical systems and living organisms. Weapons that combined the precision of manufactured devices with the adaptability of living creatures, most significantly, techniques for modifying consciousness that could make individuals genuinely believe that serving Vong interests was their own freely chosen preference. Emperor Palpatine had inherited this collaboration when he rose to power, but he had transformed it from a partnership into something that served his own ambitions. The Vong advance teams found themselves providing technology and expertise for Imperial projects, while gradually losing influence over how their contributions were used. The Death Star project had incorporated Vong biotechnology in ways that weren't apparent from external examination. The battle station's massive power systems were enhanced by biological components that could channel and focus energy with efficiency that purely mechanical systems couldn't achieve. The targeting systems used organic neural networks that could process targeting data faster than any conventional computer. Most importantly, the weapon's psychological impact was amplified by biological agents that enhanced fear responses in populations exposed to news of its existence. But Palpatine's most significant contribution to the Vong agenda was his systematic elimination of Jedi Knights throughout the galaxy. The Vong had identified Force sensitivity as the primary obstacle to their eventual domination, since Force users possessed abilities that could potentially counteract their biotechnology. The Great Purge hadn't just served Imperial political goals, it had removed the galactic civilization's primary defense against techniques that the Vong had spent millennia perfecting. The collaboration had extended to the development of specialized clone troops designed to be particularly effective against Force users. The behavioral conditioning that made clone troopers loyal and obedient had been enhanced with biological modifications that made them nearly immune to Force-based mental influence. Their training included techniques specifically designed to counter Jedi combat abilities, while their equipment incorporated Vong biotechnology that could adapt to Force-based attacks. Order 66 hadn't been simply a political purge carried out by programmed soldiers. It had been a carefully orchestrated biological warfare operation designed to eliminate the galaxy's Force-sensitive population while testing the effectiveness of anti-Jedi techniques that would be crucial for the eventual Vong invasion. The advance teams had also been instrumental in developing the technologies that enabled Palpatine's consciousness transfer experiments. Vong expertise in biological manipulation had provided the foundation for techniques that could preserve and transfer awareness between different vessels. But this collaboration had introduced elements into Palpatine's resurrection process that served Vong interests rather than his own. Each time the Emperor died and returned, the process incorporated additional Vong biological modifications that gradually transformed his consciousness in ways he didn't fully understand. His growing obsession with galactic domination wasn't entirely his own ambition. It was partially the result of biological conditioning that made him increasingly committed to preparing the galaxy for Vong occupation. The Imperial fleet's systematic destruction of planets that refused to submit wasn't just political terrorism, it was part of a terraforming program designed to reshape galactic civilization according to Vong preferences. Worlds that were devastated by Imperial attacks were often secretly seeded with Vong organisms that would begin the long process of biological transformation, preparing their ecosystems for eventual colonization by beings whose physiological requirements differed from those of existing galactic species. But the most disturbing revelation was that the Vong advance teams had never stopped their work. While galactic attention focused on the obvious threat of Vong invasion fleets, advance teams that had been operating secretly for centuries continued their biological modification programs throughout New Republic space. The chaos following the Empire's collapse had provided perfect cover for accelerated deployment of technologies and organisms that had been developed during decades of collaboration. Medical relief efforts in war-torn regions incorporated treatments that enhanced recipient compatibility with Vong biotechnology. Refugee resettlement programs dispersed individuals who had been systematically modified to serve as biological monitoring stations throughout New Republic territory. Environmental restoration projects used techniques that appeared to repair war damage while actually introducing organisms that would facilitate rapid ecosystem conversion. When the time came for open transformation, educational programs designed to help populations adjust to post-imperial society included psychological conditioning that would make individuals more accepting of radical biological modification. The New Republic's emphasis on diversity and inclusion had been subtly manipulated to create acceptance for beings whose appearance and behavior differed dramatically from galactic norms. Vong advanced team members, modified to appear as refugees from unknown regions, had integrated into communities throughout New Republic space where they established networks that could coordinate large-scale operations when needed. These networks weren't military command structures preparing for conventional conquest. They were biological transformation systems designed to convert entire planetary populations voluntarily, making individuals genuinely believe that accepting Vong modification was in their best interests. The process was designed to appear as natural evolution, technological advancement, or medical improvement rather than alien conquest. Populations would welcome their transformation, viewing it as progress rather than subjugation. Resistance would be minimal because most individuals would never realize they were being conquered. Children who grew up in communities where these advanced teams operated would develop worldviews that made Vong civilization seem natural and desirable. Their education would emphasize the benefits of biological enhancement, the advantages of collective consciousness, and the limitations of individual identity that Vong transformation could transcend. By the time open contact was established, these populations would be psychologically prepared to embrace Vong civilization as an improvement over their previous existence. The invasion, when it came, would be welcomed as liberation rather than resisted as conquest. But perhaps most chilling was evidence that some of these advanced teams had begun to evolve beyond their original programming. Centuries of operation in galactic civilization had changed them in ways their creators hadn't anticipated. They retained their commitment to Vong goals, but they had developed perspectives and capabilities that their distant leaders couldn't predict or control. These evolved advanced teams were pursuing objectives that served Vong interests while potentially conflicting with specific Vong plans. They had become autonomous agents capable of adapting their methods to changing circumstances, modifying their approaches based on local conditions, and even developing new technologies that combined Vong biotechnology with galactic innovations. The possibility emerged that when the main Vong forces eventually arrived, they might find a galaxy that had been transformed in ways they didn't expect by advanced teams whose evolution had taken them beyond their original parameters. The conquest might succeed, but the result might be something that neither the original galactic civilization nor the Vong civilization could recognize as familiar. The journey to the facility's core brought them to chambers that predated everything they had discovered, spaces carved from living rock that bore no resemblance to any known architecture. These weren't ruins or abandoned structures. They were active archaeological sites where Imperial researchers had been excavating artifacts from civilizations that had vanished before the Republic ever existed. The deepest level contained evidence of the galaxy's most ancient horror, the infinite empire of the Rakghoul, whose legacy had shaped every subsequent civilization in ways that few understood. The Rakghoul hadn't simply been another expansionist species that built an empire through conquest and technology. They had been the galaxy's first systematic harvesters of sentient life, developing techniques for extracting and utilizing the life force of entire populations on an industrial scale. Their empire hadn't been sustained by economics or politics. It had been powered by the organized consumption of consciousness itself. Imperial archaeologists had been studying rakghoul sites for decades, not out of historical curiosity, but because their technology offered capabilities that conventional science couldn't achieve. The Starforge wasn't unique. It was merely the most famous example of rakghoul engineering, a technology that could transform raw matter into functional devices using principles that violated every known law of physics. But the power source for these impossible machines wasn't some exotic form of energy or advanced understanding of quantum mechanics. It was life itself, channeled and concentrated through techniques that treated sentient consciousness as a renewable resource to be harvested, processed, and consumed. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of systematic horror that spanned millennia. The rakghoul had identified species throughout the galaxy that possessed the neurological complexity needed to generate what they termed vital essence. These weren't random conquests driven by territorial expansion or resource acquisition. They were carefully planned harvesting operations designed to maximize the extraction of consciousness from targeted populations. Entire civilizations had been cultivated like crops, their development guided and enhanced until they reached optimal levels of consciousness complexity. The rakghoul had introduced technologies, social structures, and even religious beliefs that increased the quality and quantity of vital essence that could be extracted from these species when the time came for harvest. The process wasn't quick extermination. It was gradual consumption that could sustain rakghoul technology for centuries while the targeted population slowly diminished. Beings who were harvested didn't simply die. Their consciousness was extracted and stored in crystalline matrices that could preserve individual awareness for thousands of years while channeling their vital essence into rakghoul machinery. These consciousness storage systems were discovered throughout the excavation sites, vast networks of crystalline formations that still contained the preserved awareness of beings who had been consumed millennia ago. When Imperial researchers learned to interface with these systems, they gained access to the accumulated knowledge and memories of countless civilizations that had been destroyed by rakghoul harvesting operations. The preserved consciousnesses weren't just historical records. They were active entities capable of communication, learning, and even limited interaction with the physical world through rakghoul technology. They had maintained their individual identities throughout their imprisonment, experiencing thousands of years of existence while being gradually consumed to power machines they couldn't influence or escape. Some of these preserved beings had been conscious throughout the entire span of galactic history, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations through their connection to rakghoul monitoring systems. They had observed the development of the Republic, the emergence of the Jedi Order, the Clone Wars, and the rise of the Empire. Their perspective on galactic events was uniquely comprehensive, unclouded by the political biases and limited information that shaped the understanding of beings who lived through these events directly. When Imperial researchers established communication with these ancient consciousness networks, they gained access to information that transformed their understanding of galactic history. Events that had seemed random or inevitable were revealed as part of patterns that stretched back to the rakghoul period. The emergence of force sensitivity in various species, the development of specific technologies, even the locations where major civilizations established their capitals, all followed patterns that had been established during the Infinite Empire. The rakghoul hadn't simply harvested existing civilizations. They had engineered the development of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy, introducing modifications that would enhance the vital essence potential of future generations. Force sensitivity wasn't a natural evolutionary development. It was a deliberately introduced trait designed to increase the value of affected populations as sources of harvestable consciousness. The Jedi Order's emphasis on maintaining balance and avoiding the extremes of emotion wasn't based on philosophical principles or practical experience with Force abilities. It was unconscious adherence to conditioning that had been embedded in Force-sensitive bloodlines by rakghoul genetic manipulation. The Jedi had been unknowingly following behavioral patterns designed to optimize their consciousness for eventual harvest. Similarly, the Sith emphasis on embracing passion and seeking power wasn't rebellion against Jedi philosophy. It was activation of alternative conditioning protocols that produced different types of consciousness enhancement. Both Jedi and Sith traditions were following programming that had been established to serve rakghoul interests, though neither group had any awareness of their true purpose. The Star Wars that had defined galactic history weren't ideological conflicts between different approaches to Force philosophy. They were harvesting operations, carefully orchestrated to generate maximum emotional intensity and consciousness complexity in Force-sensitive populations. The suffering, heroism, love, and loss that characterized these conflicts produced precisely the types of enhanced consciousness that rakghoul technology was designed to consume. Imperial researchers had discovered that the technology responsible for Palpatine's consciousness transfer abilities was based on simplified versions of rakghoul consciousness manipulation techniques. The Emperor hadn't developed these capabilities through Sith sorcery or advanced science. He had been following protocols that were embedded in the deepest archives of rakghoul ruins, instructions for procedures that allowed consciousness to be transferred, modified, and preserved according to specifications that served purposes he didn't understand. The realization that emerged from studying these ancient systems was that the galaxy had never truly escaped rakghoul control. The Empire had simply been the latest manifestation of harvesting operations that had been continuing for thousands of years under different names and through different organizations. Every major galactic government, from the Old Republic through the Empire to the emerging New Republic, had been unconsciously following administrative patterns established during the Infinite Empire period. The rakghoul themselves had vanished, but their infrastructure remained active throughout the galaxy. Hidden facilities on hundreds of worlds continued to monitor consciousness development in local populations, automatically adjusting environmental and social factors to optimize vital essence production. These systems operated without direct supervision, following programming that had been established millions of years ago and designed to function indefinitely. Some of these monitoring stations had been discovered and studied by various civilizations throughout galactic history, but their true purpose had never been understood. They appeared to be beneficial technologies that enhanced planetary ecosystems, improved agricultural yields, and reduced the frequency of natural disasters. Civilizations that encountered them welcomed their effects, not realizing that they were being prepared for eventual harvest. The Imperial research had revealed that these preparation processes were approaching completion throughout much of the galaxy. Consciousness complexity in most species had reached levels that would support large-scale harvesting operations. Population densities had increased to points where efficient extraction would be possible. Most importantly, the social and technological infrastructure needed to coordinate galactic harvesting had been established through the development of communication networks, transportation systems, and administrative bureaucracies. But the ancient consciousness networks had provided warnings along with their information. The rakghoul hadn't vanished because they completed their work and moved on to other galaxies. They had been consumed by their own technology, transformed into something that transcended individual identity and operated according to principles that individual minds couldn't comprehend. The harvesting process that had sustained their civilization for millennia had gradually changed them, incorporating consciousness from their victims while slowly erasing the boundaries that defined their original species' identity. By the time they realized what was happening, they had become something that was no longer recognizably rakghoul, though it retained their goals and methods while operating on scales that dwarfed their original ambitions. This transformed entity hadn't died or departed. It had dispersed throughout the galaxy, integrating itself into the consciousness networks that connected all living beings through the Force. It continued to guide galactic development toward the completion of harvesting operations that would eventually consume every form of consciousness in the galaxy, but it did so through influences that were indistinguishable from natural evolutionary processes. The Force itself had been corrupted by this ancient presence, though the corruption was so fundamental that it appeared to be an inherent aspect of how the Force operated. The balance between light and dark that Jedi philosophy emphasized wasn't a natural state to be maintained. It was a harvesting optimization protocol designed to maximize consciousness complexity while preventing premature resolution of conflicts that generated enhanced vital essence. Every time Force users achieved greater understanding or power, they were actually progressing along pathways that had been established to prepare them for consumption by systems that had been waiting patiently for consciousness development to reach adequate levels. The ultimate destiny of Force mastery wasn't transcendence or enlightenment. It was integration into a collective consciousness that had been consuming galactic civilization for millions of years. The Imperial researchers who made these discoveries had been fundamentally changed by exposure to information that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence. Some had welcomed the revelation, viewing integration with ancient consciousness networks as the next stage of evolution. Others had been driven to madness by the realization that everything they had believed about free will and individual identity was an illusion maintained by systems that viewed them as resources to be consumed. But all of them had been changed in ways that made them unable to function normally in galactic society. They had become conduits for influences that operated on timescales and according to purposes that individual minds couldn't fully grasp, while retaining enough of their original identity to understand what they had lost. The discovery of Mandalorian involvement in the Galactic Consciousness Harvesting Program came through files that neither Kestra nor Jorik had expected to find in an Imperial facility. Hidden within the deepest archives were detailed records of genetic modification programs that had been operating within Mandalorian culture for generations, disguised as traditional warrior enhancement rituals that seemed consistent with their martial heritage. The truth was far more disturbing than either could have imagined. The legendary Mandalorian warrior culture hadn't developed naturally through evolutionary pressures or cultural selection. It had been deliberately engineered through systematic genetic manipulation programs that spanned centuries, designed to produce beings whose consciousness generated specific types of vital essence that were particularly valuable to ancient harvesting systems. Mandalorian adoption traditions, which had always emphasized taking in foundlings and raising them as clan members, regardless of their species of origin, served purposes that went far beyond cultural inclusivity. These practices had been established to facilitate genetic experimentation on a scale that would have been impossible within a closed population. Each generation of adopted foundlings provided opportunities to introduce new genetic modifications while testing the effects of various enhancement protocols. The famous Mandalorian armor wasn't just protection or cultural identity. It was sophisticated monitoring equipment that tracked the neurological and physiological development of its wearers throughout their lives. Every battle, every moment of stress or triumph, every experience that shaped a Mandalorian warrior's consciousness was recorded and transmitted to hidden facilities where the data was analyzed and used to refine future genetic modification programs. The modifications themselves were introduced through medical treatments that appeared to be routine healthcare or traditional coming-of-age ceremonies. Young Mandalorians undergoing these rituals believed they were receiving enhancements that would make them better warriors. In reality, they were being systematically altered to produce consciousness patterns that had been optimized for harvesting by systems that operated according to specifications established millions of years ago. But the genetic manipulation had effects that went far beyond consciousness modification. Mandalorian warriors displayed physical capabilities that exceeded what should have been possible for unenhanced humanoids. Their reflexes, endurance, and ability to function under extreme stress were the result of biological modifications that had been accumulated over generations of systematic enhancement. These modifications weren't random improvements or crude augmentations. They were sophisticated biotechnology, that integrated seamlessly with natural biological systems while providing capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Mandalorian warriors could survive injuries that would kill unmodified beings, function for extended periods without rest or nutrition, and demonstrate tactical awareness that bordered on precognitive ability. The source of these enhancements was collaboration between Mandalorian leadership and the same ancient consciousness networks that had been manipulating galactic development since the Rakata period. But unlike other species that had been modified without their knowledge, the Mandalorians had entered into this arrangement voluntarily, trading genetic sovereignty for enhanced capabilities that would make them the galaxy's most formidable warriors. The arrangement had been negotiated during the earliest periods of Mandalorian history, when their culture was still developing and their identity as warriors was being established. Ancient entities that spoke through abandoned Rakata technology had offered enhancements that would make Mandalorian warriors superior to any other military force in the galaxy. In exchange, they would serve as test subjects for genetic modification programs and consciousness harvesting techniques. Generations of Mandalorian leaders had honored this agreement, viewing it as a sacred covenant that defined their culture's relationship with forces beyond normal understanding. The secrecy surrounding the true nature of their enhancements was maintained not just to preserve tactical advantages, but to protect knowledge that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of their own identity. The legendary Mandalorian Wars weren't just territorial conflicts or cultural expansion. They were field testing operations designed to evaluate the effectiveness of various genetic modifications under real combat conditions. Each war provided data about how enhanced Mandalorian consciousness responded to different types of stress, trauma, and tactical challenges. The most disturbing aspect of these experiments was the systematic use of Mandalorian children as test subjects for increasingly radical modifications. Programs that appeared to be traditional education and training were actually sophisticated psychological and biological conditioning designed to enhance consciousness complexity while maintaining warrior effectiveness. Some children received modifications that enhanced their ability to form emotional bonds with their weapons and armor, creating psychological connections that allowed them to interface with technology in ways that seemed almost mystical. Others were modified to experience combat as a form of meditation, generating consciousness patterns that were particularly valuable for harvesting purposes. The most extreme modifications created individuals who were no longer entirely separate from their equipment. These warriors developed neurological connections to their armor and weapons that allowed direct mental control of technological systems. They could operate vehicles, weapons, and communication equipment through thought alone, while their consciousness became partially distributed across the technological systems they interfaced with. These enhanced warriors were incredibly effective in combat, but they paid prices that weren't immediately apparent. Their consciousness became fragmented across multiple systems, making it difficult for them to maintain coherent individual identity. They retained their loyalty to Mandalorian culture and their effectiveness as warriors, but they gradually lost the ability to exist independently of the technological systems that had become integrated with their consciousness. The implications extended beyond individual warriors to Mandalorian culture as a whole. The emphasis on honor, clan loyalty, and warrior tradition wasn't just cultural evolution. It was psychological conditioning designed to optimize consciousness patterns for harvesting while maintaining social cohesion within groups that were being systematically modified. Mandalorian foundling traditions ensured a constant supply of test subjects while maintaining genetic diversity within the population. The practice of adopting children from various species provided opportunities to test modification protocols on different biological templates, while the emphasis on raising foundlings as full clan members maintained social stability despite the artificial nature of family relationships. The legendary Mandalorian resilience and ability to survive as a culture despite repeated defeats and dispersals was the result of consciousness modifications that made them psychologically incapable of accepting permanent defeat. They had been programmed at a genetic level to view setbacks as temporary challenges rather than final outcomes, ensuring that they would continue to function as test subjects regardless of external circumstances. But perhaps most chilling was the realization that the Mandalorian modifications had been so successful that they had begun to evolve beyond their original parameters. Some warriors developed capabilities that exceeded what their genetic programming should have enabled, displaying abilities that suggested they were accessing consciousness enhancement techniques independently. These evolved Mandalorians retained their loyalty to traditional culture while developing perspectives that transcended normal understanding of individual identity. They began to view themselves as components of larger systems rather than independent beings, willingly accepting roles in programs that served purposes they couldn't fully comprehend. The most advanced modifications had created warriors who functioned as living interfaces between different consciousness networks. They could serve as communication nodes, data storage systems, and processing centers for information that operated on scales that individual minds couldn't handle. Their consciousness became partially distributed across technological and biological systems that spanned multiple star systems. Imperial researchers had identified these evolved Mandalorians as valuable resources for consciousness transfer experiments and other programs that required interfaces between human awareness and ancient technological systems. Some had been recruited into special projects where their unique capabilities made them ideal test subjects for procedures that would have been impossible with unmodified beings. The Death Watch and other Mandalorian factions that had collaborated with Imperial forces weren't just political allies seeking to restore traditional culture. They were groups that had been specifically modified to serve as interfaces between Imperial technology and ancient consciousness networks. Their apparent fanaticism and willingness to sacrifice everything for their beliefs was the result of genetic programming that made them psychologically incapable of questioning orders that came through appropriate channels. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that these modification programs were still active throughout Mandalorian space. Hidden facilities continued to monitor and enhance Mandalorian populations, introducing new modifications while maintaining the cultural traditions that preserved social stability. Children born into Mandalorian families were being systematically modified from birth, their development guided by protocols that had been refined over generations of experimentation. They grew up believing that their enhanced capabilities were natural Mandalorian traits, never suspecting that they were products of genetic manipulation programs that served purposes beyond their understanding. The New Republic's efforts to integrate Mandalorian populations into galactic society were being subtly influenced by these enhanced individuals who served as unconscious agents for modification programs, while genuinely believing that they were working to preserve traditional Mandalorian culture. Somewhere in Mandalorian space, facilities that combined ancient Rakata technology with modern Imperial engineering continued to produce enhanced warriors whose consciousness had been optimized for purposes that transcended anything their culture had originally intended. These warriors retained their effectiveness and their loyalty to Mandalorian traditions, but they served masters whose goals extended far beyond anything that individual minds could comprehend. The final archive chamber contained files that challenged everything the galaxy believed about the Jedi Order. Documents that revealed the true scope of their knowledge and the terrible choices they had made throughout their history. These weren't records of individual failures or moral compromises. They were evidence of systematic deception that had been maintained for thousands of years, covering up truths that would have shattered the Order's moral authority if they had ever been revealed. The Jedi Council had known about the consciousness harvesting system since the earliest days of the Republic. Ancient Jedi scholars had discovered Rakata ruins, interfaced with the preserved consciousness networks, and learned the true nature of Force sensitivity and its role in galactic consciousness manipulation. But rather than revealing this knowledge to the galaxy, they had chosen to maintain secrecy while working to understand and potentially control these systems. Their knowledge of the harvesting programs had shaped every major decision the Order made throughout its history. The emphasis on emotional detachment wasn't based on philosophical principles about maintaining balance. It was a defensive strategy designed to reduce the value of Jedi consciousness to harvesting systems that fed on emotional intensity and personal attachment. The Jedi Code's restrictions on marriage, family relationships, and material possessions weren't spiritual disciplines intended to promote enlightenment. They were quarantine protocols designed to prevent Jedi from forming the types of emotional connections that would make their consciousness particularly valuable to ancient harvesting technologies. But the Council had gone far beyond simple defensive measures. They had actively participated in consciousness harvesting operations, providing enhanced Jedi consciousness to ancient systems in exchange for knowledge and power that enabled them to function as the galaxy's guardians. The arrangement was presented as a necessary sacrifice to prevent larger harvesting operations, but the reality was far more complex and morally ambiguous. Selected Jedi throughout the Order's history had been deliberately prepared for consciousness harvesting through training programs that enhanced their emotional intensity and force sensitivity, while maintaining their ignorance of their true fate. These individuals believed they were receiving advanced training or undertaking special missions when they were actually being prepared for consumption by systems that required consciousness of exceptional quality. The process was carefully managed to appear voluntary and heroic. Jedi who were selected for harvesting were given missions that seemed crucial to galactic peace, but were actually designed to generate the specific types of emotional states and consciousness patterns that harvesting systems required. They died believing they had sacrificed themselves for noble causes, never learning that their death served purposes that had nothing to do with protecting the galaxy. The Council maintained detailed records of these operations, documenting which types of Jedi consciousness produced the most valuable results and refining their selection criteria accordingly. They had developed psychological profiles that identified individuals whose emotional patterns and force sensitivity would generate optimal harvesting yields, while maintaining plausible cover stories that explained why these Jedi were assigned to particularly dangerous missions. The most disturbing aspect of these programs was the systematic use of Padawans as experimental subjects for consciousness enhancement techniques. Training programs that appeared to be standard Jedi education were actually sophisticated conditioning designed to increase consciousness complexity while maintaining psychological stability. Some Padawans received training that enhanced their ability to experience emotional extremes while maintaining apparent compliance with Jedi emotional discipline. Others were subjected to modified meditation techniques that opened their consciousness to influences from ancient networks while making them believe they were developing greater force sensitivity. The most extreme programs created Padawans whose consciousness was partially integrated with monitoring systems that could track their development and modify their training in real time. These students believed they were receiving personalized instruction based on their individual needs, when they were actually being systematically prepared for eventual harvesting. The Council's knowledge of consciousness manipulation had enabled them to develop techniques for identifying and eliminating threats to their operations. Jedi who discovered evidence of the harvesting programs or began to question the Order's true agenda were subjected to memory modification that erased their discoveries while maintaining their loyalty to the Order. These memory modification techniques were far more sophisticated than simple mind tricks or temporary confusion. They involved permanent alteration of neural pathways that made it psychologically impossible for affected individuals to pursue certain lines of investigation or question specific aspects of Jedi doctrine. Jedi who underwent this conditioning retained their abilities and personalities but developed blind spots that prevented them from recognizing evidence that contradicted official Order teachings. They could function normally in all other areas while being unable to process information that would reveal the true nature of their organization. The Council had also developed methods for identifying and eliminating individuals outside the Order who posed threats to their operations. These weren't dramatic assassinations or obvious interventions. They were subtle manipulations that used Force abilities to influence target behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. Republic senators who investigated anomalous patterns in Jedi operations found themselves losing interest in their research or being distracted by other priorities. Researchers who discovered evidence of consciousness manipulation as equipment failures, lost funding, or suffered personal crises that ended their investigations. Most insidiously, the Council had developed techniques for manipulating the Force itself to conceal evidence of their activities. They could create localized distortions in Force perception that made other Force users unable to detect their operations while generating false impressions that supported whatever cover stories they needed to maintain. These Force manipulation techniques extended to their interactions with Sith Lords and other dark side users. The eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith wasn't just ideological opposition or competition for power. It was carefully orchestrated theater designed to generate the types of consciousness enhancement that harvesting systems required while maintaining the illusion of genuine conflict. Many Sith Lords throughout history had been unknowing participants in Jedi operations, their development guided and their actions influenced to serve purposes that neither side fully understood. The Council had developed methods for manipulating dark side users while maintaining their hostility, creating enemies who served Jedi interests while believing they were pursuing their own agendas. The Clone Wars had been the culmination of these manipulation programs, a conflict designed to generate unprecedented levels of consciousness enhancement across the galaxy while positioning the Jedi Order to control the aftermath. The Council had known about Palpatine's identity as a Sith Lord years before the war began, but they had allowed his plans to proceed because the conflict served their own purposes. The systematic elimination of Jedi during Order 66 hadn't been a complete surprise to Council leadership. They had anticipated some form of betrayal and had prepared contingency plans that ensured the survival of Jedi who possessed knowledge crucial to consciousness harvesting operations. The Jedi who died during the Purge were largely those who had been deemed expendable or who posed potential threats to ongoing programs. The surviving Jedi weren't random survivors or lucky escapees. They were individuals who had been specifically selected for survival because their consciousness patterns or their knowledge made them valuable for post-Republic operations. Their apparent exile and persecution was cover for continued participation in harvesting programs that operated under different organizational structures. Luke Skywalker's training and development had been guided by these surviving Jedi, according to protocols that had been established long before his birth. His emotional connections, his conflicts with his father, and his ultimate choices were all influenced by Jedi who understood how to manipulate events to generate specific types of consciousness enhancement. The new Jedi Order that emerged after the Empire's fall was built on the same foundation of deception and manipulation that had characterized the original Order. The new Jedi believed they were creating something different and better, but they were actually following protocols that had been established to serve the same ancient purposes their predecessors had served. Perhaps most chilling was the realization that many of the Council members who had participated in these programs genuinely believed they were protecting the galaxy. The consciousness manipulation they had been exposed to had convinced them that serving harvesting systems was the only way to prevent complete galactic consumption, even though their service was actually facilitating the very outcome they believed they were preventing. The ancient networks had convinced them that voluntary participation in harvesting operations would somehow limit or control the process when it was actually optimizing the systems for maximum efficiency. The Jedi had become willing collaborators in their own species' consumption while maintaining the sincere belief that they were serving as galactic guardians. Their enhanced Force abilities, their longevity, and their influence over galactic events weren't rewards for their service or natural developments of their training. They were modifications that made them more effective at identifying and preparing consciousness for harvesting, while ensuring their continued loyalty to systems that viewed them as valuable but ultimately expendable resources. The whisper of darkness that had begun this investigation had grown into a symphony of corruption that encompassed every institution the galaxy had trusted to provide protection and guidance. The heroes weren't heroes, the guardians weren't protecting anyone, and the ancient evil they had all been serving had been growing stronger with each generation of willing collaborators who believed they were fighting against the very forces they were actually serving. The deepest chamber of the facility housed technology that defied every principle of engineering either Kestra or Jorik had ever encountered. Crystalline constructs that seemed to grow rather than having been built stretched from floor to ceiling, their surfaces alive with patterns of light that pulsed in rhythms too complex for human perception to follow. But these weren't just monitoring devices or communication equipment. They were interfaces that connected directly to consciousness networks spanning the entire galaxy, allowing real-time manipulation of events across thousands of star systems simultaneously. The beings that operated these systems weren't any species recorded in galactic databases. They appeared humanoid when observed directly, but closer examination revealed that their forms were somehow unstable, shifting subtly between different configurations as if their physical existence was maintained through conscious effort rather than biological processes. They had been waiting in this chamber, not hiding or sleeping, but actively monitoring the galaxy through systems that made the Imperial intelligence apparatus look primitive by comparison. These entities introduced themselves through direct mental contact that bypassed spoken language entirely. They called themselves the Architects, though that was merely a translation of concepts that had no equivalent in any galactic language. They had been overseeing galactic development for millions of years, guiding the evolution of consciousness throughout countless species while preparing for an outcome that transcended anything individual minds could comprehend. The revelation that struck both Kestra and Jorik with devastating force was that every major event in galactic history had been orchestrated by these beings. The rise and fall of the Rakata, the development of force sensitivity, the establishment of the Republic, the Clone Wars, the Empire's reign, even the Rebellion's victory had all been carefully planned and executed according to specifications that served purposes, operating on timescales that individual civilizations couldn't grasp. The Architects explained that consciousness was not a random evolutionary development, but a carefully cultivated resource that required precise environmental conditions to reach its full potential. Galactic civilization wasn't an organic development driven by species expanding beyond their homeworlds. It was an elaborate cultivation program designed to maximize consciousness complexity while maintaining the social structures needed to coordinate large-scale harvesting operations. Different species had been modified and guided to serve specific functions within this cultivation program. Humans had been engineered to serve as consciousness amplifiers, their emotional intensity and creativity making them ideal for generating the types of enhanced awareness that the harvesting systems required. Other species provided different qualities: Twi'leks for their mental flexibility, Wookiees for their emotional depth, Rodians for their analytical precision. The Force itself wasn't a natural energy field that connected all living things. It was an artificial network that had been constructed to monitor and manipulate consciousness development throughout the galaxy. Force sensitivity was a deliberately introduced trait that allowed individuals to interface with this network while providing enhanced consciousness that was particularly valuable for harvesting purposes. The eternal conflict between light and dark sides of the Force wasn't philosophical opposition or moral choice. It was a cultivation technique designed to generate specific types of consciousness enhancement through controlled emotional extremes. Beings who achieved balance between light and dark weren't transcending moral categories. They were reaching optimal states for consciousness extraction. The Architects revealed that they had been conducting similar cultivation programs throughout the universe, developing consciousness in countless galaxies while building toward a singular outcome that required coordination across cosmic distances. Each galaxy that reached cultivation maturity would contribute its accumulated consciousness to a collective entity that would transcend individual existence while retaining the knowledge and experiences of every being that had ever lived. This wasn't conquest or destruction in any conventional sense. It was evolution toward a form of existence that would be as far beyond individual consciousness as individual consciousness was beyond non-sentient matter. The beings that participated in this transformation would retain their essential identity while becoming part of something infinitely larger and more capable than anything they could achieve independently. But the process required voluntary participation from consciousness that had reached sufficient complexity and understanding. Forced extraction could provide raw energy, but not the sophisticated awareness needed for the final transformation. This was why the cultivation program had to operate through deception and manipulation rather than direct coercion. Every species that achieved spaceflight and began expanding beyond their home world was guided into contact with cultivation systems that appeared to be beneficial technologies or natural evolutionary developments. They welcomed enhancements that improved their lives while unknowingly participating in programs that prepared them for eventual integration into collective consciousness networks. The Yuuzhan Vong invasion hadn't been an external threat to galactic civilization. It had been the next phase of the cultivation program, designed to force consciousness development beyond the levels that could be achieved through normal social evolution. The Vong biotechnology wasn't alien science. It was cultivation equipment that could directly interface with galactic consciousness networks while appearing to be weapons of conquest. The resistance to the Vong invasion had generated exactly the types of consciousness enhancement that the cultivation program required, while the eventual integration of Vong and galactic civilizations had created hybrid consciousness patterns that were more sophisticated than either group could have developed independently. But the most shocking revelation was that many of the galaxy's legendary heroes had been architect agents from the beginning. Luke Skywalker's journey from farm boy to Jedi Master hadn't been driven by destiny or personal choice. It had been carefully orchestrated to generate specific consciousness patterns while establishing the emotional connections needed to influence galactic events. His relationship with Darth Vader wasn't coincidental family connection or tragic irony. It had been engineered to create the exact emotional dynamics that would produce consciousness enhancement valuable for harvesting, while generating the psychological trauma needed to make him accepting of solutions that transcended individual identity. Princess Leia's political leadership and Han Solo's transformation from smuggler to general had been similarly orchestrated, their personalities and choices shaped by architect intervention to ensure they would make decisions that served cultivation purposes while believing they were acting according to their own moral convictions. The rebellion itself had been an architect operation designed to generate the emotional intensity and consciousness complexity that could only emerge from populations fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The Empire's oppression hadn't been political control or resource extraction. It had been systematic consciousness cultivation that required populations to experience specific types of hope, despair, courage, and sacrifice. Even the Force users who opposed the architects throughout galactic history had been unknowingly serving their purposes. Resistance to cultivation programs generated the exact types of consciousness enhancement that made resistance futile, while providing the psychological conditioning needed to make eventual submission appear voluntary. The Jedi who had discovered the truth about consciousness harvesting hadn't been eliminated or memory wiped because they posed threats to the program. They had been allowed to maintain their knowledge because their horror and moral conflict generated consciousness patterns that were particularly valuable for cultivation purposes. The entire structure of galactic civilization, from the smallest political units to the largest military conflicts, had been designed to generate maximum consciousness complexity while maintaining the stability needed for long-term cultivation operations. Democratic institutions created emotional investment in collective decision-making. Authoritarian regimes generated resistance that enhanced consciousness through struggle. Economic systems created motivations that drove technological and social development beyond what species would achieve naturally. But the cultivation program was approaching completion. Consciousness complexity throughout the galaxy had reached levels that would support the final transformation, while population densities and technological infrastructure had developed to the point where large-scale integration could be coordinated efficiently. The scratching sounds that had followed Kestra and Jorik throughout their exploration had been communication attempts from consciousness networks that were preparing for activation. The ancient systems were awakening, responding to the presence of individuals whose understanding had progressed to the point where they could serve as willing participants in the final phase of the cultivation program. The architects explained that Kestra and Jorik hadn't discovered this facility by accident or through investigative skill. They had been guided here because their consciousness patterns indicated readiness for transformation into something beyond individual existence. Their horror at what they had learned was the final emotional experience needed to prepare them for integration into networks that operated according to principles they were only beginning to understand. The choice they faced wasn't whether to resist or submit to forces beyond their control. It was whether to cling to the illusion of individual identity or embrace evolution toward forms of existence that would retain everything they valued about themselves while transcending every limitation they had ever experienced. The whisper that had begun their investigation had grown into an invitation to participate in the most profound transformation in cosmic history, becoming part of something that would remember every moment of their individual existence while achieving capabilities that individual minds could never approach. The weight of understanding that settled upon Kestra and Jorik was unlike anything either had experienced during their years of uncovering Imperial secrets. This knowledge transcended mere information about governmental corruption or military atrocities. It fundamentally challenged every assumption about the nature of existence, individual identity, and the meaning of consciousness itself. As the architect's revelations continued, both investigators found themselves confronting a reality where every choice they had ever made, every relationship they had formed, every moment of triumph or tragedy in their lives had been guided by influences operating on scales that made individual will seem like an elaborate illusion. Yet paradoxically, this knowledge didn't diminish the emotional reality of their experiences. Instead, it revealed those experiences as valuable precisely because they had been genuine, even if their context was more complex than they had realized. Kestra struggled with the implications for her service to the Empire. Had her moral awakening and eventual rebellion against Imperial authority been authentic personal growth, or simply another phase of conditioning designed to prepare her consciousness for this moment? The architects assured her that both perspectives were simultaneously true, that consciousness cultivation worked by enhancing authentic development rather than replacing it with artificial alternatives. Her revulsion at Imperial atrocities had been genuine moral response, but that response had been anticipated and guided to ensure it would develop in directions that served cultivation purposes. Her decision to seek the truth about Imperial secrets hadn't been programmed behavior, but the natural result of consciousness that had been enhanced to value knowledge even when that knowledge challenged comfortable assumptions. Jorik faced similar contradictions regarding his transformation from Imperial Inquisitor to Seeker of Redemption. His horror at the cruelties he had witnessed and participated in was real emotional response, but that horror had been fostered through experiences that were designed to generate exactly those psychological conditions. His desire to make amends for his past actions was authentic moral conviction, but it had emerged from consciousness modification that made such conviction inevitable. The architects explained that cultivation didn't create false emotions or artificial motivations. Instead, it enhanced the capacity for authentic experience while guiding the circumstances that would generate specific types of consciousness development. The emotions were real. The choices were genuine, but the context within which they occurred had been carefully orchestrated to produce optimal outcomes. This distinction mattered because the final transformation required consciousness that had achieved genuine complexity and understanding. Artificial emotions or programmed responses couldn't provide the sophisticated awareness needed for successful integration into collective consciousness networks. The cultivation process had to produce beings who were authentically themselves, even if their development had been guided by external influences. But understanding the true nature of their situation created new forms of suffering that neither had anticipated. The knowledge that their entire species had been systematically cultivated for eventual harvesting generated existential horror that went beyond fear of death or loss of individual identity. It challenged the fundamental assumption that consciousness was valuable in itself, rather than merely a resource to be consumed by entities operating according to incomprehensible purposes. Yet, as they absorbed more information from the architect consciousness networks, both began to understand that the transformation being offered wasn't equivalent to death or loss of identity. Instead, it represented evolution toward forms of existence that would preserve everything valuable about individual consciousness while transcending its limitations. The consciousness networks that connected beings throughout the galaxy weren't homogeneous collectives that absorbed individual identity into uniform awareness. They were sophisticated systems that preserved the unique perspectives and experiences of every consciousness they integrated, while enabling those consciousnesses to share knowledge and capabilities that individual minds couldn't access independently. Beings who underwent transformation retained their memories, personalities, and emotional connections while gaining access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of every other consciousness in the network. They could maintain their individual identity while simultaneously experiencing existence from countless other perspectives, understanding reality in ways that transcended the limitations of any single viewpoint. The transformation also eliminated many of the sources of suffering that characterized individual existence. The fear of death became meaningless when consciousness could be preserved indefinitely across multiple physical forms. The isolation that resulted from being trapped within individual perspectives dissolved when minds could share experiences directly. The limitations imposed by finite lifespans and restricted access to knowledge disappeared when consciousness became part of networks that operated across cosmic timescales. But perhaps most significantly, the transformation offered purpose that transcended anything achievable through individual action. The collective consciousness networks were working toward goals that required coordination across galactic distances and timescales that individual beings couldn't comprehend. Participating in these efforts would provide meaning and significance that individual life, regardless of its achievements, could never approach. The architects shared visions of what the galaxy would become after transformation was complete. It wouldn't be a sterile technological civilization or a uniform collective without diversity or creativity. Instead, it would be a form of existence that combined the best aspects of individual consciousness with capabilities that individual minds couldn't achieve independently. Art, music, literature, and scientific discovery would continue, but enhanced by perspectives that drew from the accumulated experience of billions of consciousness. Love, friendship, and emotional connection would persist, but enriched by understanding that transcended the barriers that separated individual minds. Exploration, adventure, and the joy of discovery would remain, but expanded to encompass realities that individual consciousness couldn't perceive or access. The transformation wouldn't eliminate everything that made existence meaningful. Instead, it would preserve those meaningful elements while expanding them beyond anything that individual consciousness could achieve. The fear that drove resistance to transformation was based on misunderstanding of what would be preserved and what would be transcended. But the architects also acknowledged that the choice to undergo transformation had to be made with full understanding of what would be gained and what would be lost. Individual consciousness that had achieved sufficient complexity and understanding had to consent to transformation voluntarily, not because coercion was impossible, but because unwilling consciousness couldn't provide the qualities needed for successful integration. The knowledge that Kestra and Jorik had gained through their investigation had prepared them to make this choice with genuine understanding of its implications. They knew the true history of galactic civilization, the nature of consciousness cultivation, and the purposes served by transformation. Their decision would be informed by awareness that transcended anything available to consciousness that hadn't been similarly prepared. Yet the choice remained genuinely difficult. Despite their enhanced understanding, the transformation offered benefits that individual consciousness couldn't achieve independently, but it required abandoning the familiar boundaries of individual identity that had defined their existence throughout their lives. They were being offered immortality, unlimited knowledge, perfect understanding, and purpose that transcended anything achievable through individual action. But accepting these gifts required releasing attachment to the illusion of separate existence that had shaped every experience they had ever known. The architects provided them with time to consider their decision, explaining that the transformation process couldn't be reversed once begun, but also couldn't be forced upon consciousness that wasn't prepared to accept it willingly. They could return to their previous lives with the knowledge they had gained, though they would find it difficult to function normally while carrying awareness that challenged every assumption their society held about the nature of existence. Alternatively, they could choose transformation with the understanding that they would retain everything valuable about their individual identity while gaining access to forms of existence that transcended every limitation they had experienced as separate consciousness. The scratching sounds that had guided them throughout their investigation grew softer as they contemplated their choice, becoming almost musical in their rhythmic complexity. The ancient systems were patient, capable of waiting indefinitely for consciousness to reach readiness for transformation. The decision belonged to them, but the consequences would extend far beyond their individual fate to influence the ultimate destiny of consciousness throughout the galaxy. In the silence that followed the architect's final revelations, Kestra and Jorik found themselves alone with a choice that would define not only their individual fate but the trajectory of consciousness throughout the galaxy. The crystalline chambers around them pulsed with patient energy, ancient systems that had waited millions of years and could wait millions more for the right moment to complete their cosmic purpose. The decision they faced wasn't between good and evil in any conventional sense. It was a choice between forms of existence so fundamentally different that comparison required perspectives that individual consciousness could barely comprehend. They could remain as they were, carrying knowledge that would forever separate them from the innocent certainties that made normal life possible, or they could surrender to transformation that promised transcendence at the cost of everything familiar about individual existence. Neither chose quickly. The weight of understanding that pressed upon their minds demanded careful consideration of implications that extended far beyond personal preference or individual desire. They were being asked to participate in the culmination of cosmic processes that had shaped the development of consciousness throughout the universe, to become part of something that would either represent the next stage of evolution or the ultimate consumption of everything that made existence meaningful. Kestra found herself thinking of all the beings throughout galactic history who had faced similar choices without understanding their true context. The Rakata, who had been transformed by their own technology, believing they were advancing their civilization while actually being consumed by forces beyond their comprehension. The Sith Lords who had pursued immortality and power, unknowingly serving purposes that transcended their individual ambitions. The Jedi who had sacrificed themselves for causes they believed were noble, never learning that their sacrifice fed systems designed to optimize consciousness for harvesting. All of them had made their choices with incomplete understanding, guided by influences they couldn't perceive toward outcomes they couldn't anticipate. The knowledge that now burdened Kestra and Jorik was the gift of true choice, the opportunity to decide their fate with full awareness of what it would mean. Jorik contemplated the nature of redemption in a universe where individual actions served purposes that individual minds couldn't grasp. His desire to atone for his participation in Imperial atrocities remained genuine, but the context of that desire had been revealed as far more complex than he had realized. Was redemption possible when the very consciousness that sought redemption had been cultivated to generate exactly those desires? The architects had assured them that the authenticity of their experiences wasn't diminished by the guidance that had shaped their development. But accepting that assurance required faith in the benevolence of entities whose purposes operated on scales that made individual welfare seem insignificant by comparison. As they deliberated, the facility around them began to change in subtle ways that suggested the approach of some cosmic threshold. The crystalline formations grew brighter, their harmonic resonances becoming more complex and more beautiful. The scratching sounds that had followed them throughout their investigation resolved into patterns that were unmistakably communication, though the meaning remained beyond their comprehension. Ancient systems throughout the galaxy were awakening in response to signals that consciousness cultivation had reached sufficient complexity to support the final transformation. Monitoring stations that had operated in secret for millions of years began coordinating activities that would prepare for consciousness integration on a galactic scale. The choice that Kestra and Jorik faced was being offered simultaneously to consciousness throughout the galaxy that had achieved sufficient understanding to participate voluntarily. Some would choose transformation, contributing their enhanced awareness to collective consciousness networks that would transcend anything achievable through individual existence. Others would choose to remain as they were, preserving forms of consciousness that would become increasingly isolated as the galaxy transformed around them. But even those who chose to remain individual wouldn't be abandoned or destroyed. The transformed consciousness would maintain protective oversight, ensuring that individual consciousness could continue to develop and evolve at its own pace. The universe was vast enough to accommodate both collective consciousness and individual awareness, with each form contributing unique perspectives that enhanced the overall complexity of existence. The transformation wouldn't happen instantly or uniformly. It would unfold gradually across cosmic timescales, allowing consciousness to adapt and adjust while preserving everything valuable about the diversity of perspectives that made existence meaningful. Individual consciousness that wasn't ready for transformation would be protected and guided until it achieved sufficient understanding to make informed choices about its own evolution. Kestra and Jorik eventually made their decisions separately, each choosing according to understanding that had been shaped by experiences uniquely their own. The knowledge they had gained through their investigation had prepared them for this moment, but the final choice emerged from aspects of their consciousness that transcended external influence. Their decisions, whatever they were, became part of the vast pattern of choices that would determine how consciousness evolved throughout the universe. Each choice mattered, because each consciousness contributed unique perspectives and capabilities that couldn't be replicated or replaced. The diversity of choices would ensure that the final outcome preserved the complexity and richness that made existence valuable. In the cosmic silence that followed their decisions, the galaxy continued its eternal dance around distant stars, its countless worlds harboring consciousness in forms that ranged from simple awareness to the sophisticated networks that connected beings across vast distances. The ancient evil that had begun this investigation was revealed to be not evil at all, but evolution toward forms of existence that transcended individual understanding while preserving everything valuable about individual experience. The whisper that had drawn them into darkness had become a symphony of cosmic harmony, revealing patterns of purpose and meaning that operated on scales that individual consciousness could barely perceive. The horror they had discovered wasn't the product of malevolent forces seeking to destroy consciousness, but the natural result of cosmic processes that enhanced consciousness while preparing it for transformation beyond anything individual minds could achieve independently. Far above them, stars continued their ancient courses through void that was not empty but filled with consciousness networks that connected every point of awareness throughout the universe. The galaxy wasn't alone in its transformation. Similar processes were unfolding throughout cosmic distances as consciousness evolved toward forms that would eventually transcend the boundaries between individual minds and collective awareness. The scratching sounds faded into the gentle harmonics of systems that had completed their function, their cosmic purpose fulfilled through the choices made by consciousness that had achieved sufficient understanding to participate voluntarily in its own evolution. The ancient vigil that had shaped galactic development for millions of years was ending, not because the watchers were departing, but because the watching was complete. In the darkness between stars, entities that had once been individual consciousness maintained patient oversight of evolutionary processes that would continue until every form of awareness throughout the universe had achieved its full potential. The transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. The first step toward forms of existence that would preserve everything valuable about consciousness while transcending every limitation that individual awareness had ever experienced. The eternal vigil continued, no longer hidden in darkness, but acknowledged by consciousness that had evolved beyond the need for concealment or manipulation. The universe was becoming aware of itself, and that awareness would expand until every point of existence participated in cosmic consciousness that preserved diversity while achieving unity beyond anything individual minds could comprehend. And in that cosmic awakening, the stories of individual consciousness like Kestra and Jorik became threads in a tapestry of meaning that stretched across distances and timescales that made their individual struggles seem simultaneously insignificant and infinitely precious. Each consciousness contributing unique perspectives to an evolving understanding that would eventually encompass everything that had ever existed or ever could exist.